Many people expect that a spiritual awakening will flood their life with endless energy, passion, and clarity, a kind of permanent high. But for many, the opposite happens. Instead of feeling fired up, they find themselves strangely unmotivated, detached from old ambitions, and unsure of what to do next. From a Jungian perspective, this is not failure or regression. It is a natural stage in the deep transformation of the psyche. When an awakening occurs, the old ego-driven motivations often dissolve, leaving a gap before new soul-aligned motivations emerge. The unconscious begins reorganizing, pulling energy inward to integrate the new awareness, and this inward focus can feel like stagnation from the outside. Understanding this stage through Jung's lens helps us see why our usual goals lose their pull, how the self begins to redirect our life path, and why this period of nothingness can be the fertile ground from which a deeper, more authentic motivation will grow. The dissolution of ego-driven goals after awakening and its impact on motivation can be one of the most disorienting experiences on the spiritual path, especially for those who have built much of their identity around ambition, achievement, and constant striving. Before a spiritual awakening, most people's goals are largely shaped by the ego, the conscious personality structure that Carl Jung described as the center of our awareness, but not the whole of the psyche. The ego is necessary for navigating the external world, but it often operates according to the expectations of society, cultural conditioning, and the need for approval or status. We pursue careers because they promise prestige, relationships because they fulfill a socially endorsed image of success, possessions because they symbolize security or worthiness. These ego-driven goals are fueled by desire, comparison, and the hope of becoming more in the eyes of others or even in our own inner narrative. When a spiritual awakening occurs, the relationship between the ego and the deeper self begins to shift dramatically. The self, in Jungian terms, is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, and it represents the true center of our being. Awakening often pulls us out of identification with the ego's narrow concerns and shows us a much larger, interconnected reality. Suddenly, many of the old pursuits lose their emotional charge. The promotions, accolades, possessions, and titles that once seemed so important can feel strangely hollow, as if they belonged to someone else's life. This is because awakening often dissolves the illusions that gave those goals their meaning. The unconscious, with its vast storehouse of archetypal wisdom, begins to reveal that many of our ambitions were not authentically ours, but were instead inherited scripts from culture, family, or peer groups. This dissolution can be deeply unsettling, because the ego thrives on having a direction, a sense of progress, and tangible achievements to chase. Without these, the conscious mind can feel unmoored, as if it has lost its map. From a psychological perspective, this stage represents a withdrawal of libido, the psychic energy that fuels our interests and activities from external objects and goals. That energy is often redirected inward, toward integrating the awakening experience and restructuring our priorities. In Jung's language, the psyche is attempting to bring the conscious personality into greater harmony with the self, but during this process, there can be a gap where old motivations have faded and new ones have not yet fully formed. The impact on daily life can be profound. A person who once thrived on deadlines, projects, and measurable success may suddenly find it difficult to care about completing tasks. Activities that once generated excitement might now feel meaningless. Even social interactions that used to be enjoyable can seem draining or superficial. This is not necessarily depression, though it can resemble it from the outside. It is a recalibration of the psyche's priorities. The old motivations were tied to an identity that is now dissolving, and the emerging identity is not yet fully formed. From Jung's perspective, this stage is not a mistake but a necessary part of individuation, the process of becoming whole. The ego must relinquish its dominance to allow the deeper self to guide life's direction. However, the ego often resists this surrender, clinging to familiar structures and goals even as they no longer provide satisfaction. This resistance can create inner tension, where part of the psyche wants to let go and trust the unfolding process, while another part feels anxious about drifting without clear aims. The absence of motivation in this stage is therefore not simply a lack but a transitional clearing, a space where old patterns are dismantled to make room for something new. Culturally, this can be a challenging place to inhabit because our society tends to equate constant productivity with value. People in this stage may feel pressure from others to get back on track, which often means returning to ego-driven pursuits. But if they try to force themselves back into those old roles, they may find that their energy refuses to cooperate. The psyche is wise in this way. It withholds energy from activities that no longer serve the deeper process, even if they once seemed vital. This can be frustrating for the conscious mind, which may interpret the lack of motivation as laziness or failure, but from a Jungian view, it is the self protecting the emerging alignment by ensuring the old ways cannot be fully re-inhabited. This inner shift also changes the way we experience time. Before awakening, time often feels linear and goal-oriented, a series of steps leading toward a desired outcome. After the dissolution of ego goals, time can feel more fluid, less about reaching milestones and more about being present to the unfolding moment. This shift in temporal perception can add to the sense that motivation has vanished, because the constant forward momentum of the ego is replaced by a more cyclical, organic rhythm. The psyche is no longer racing toward external markers, but is attuning to the deeper, slower movements of inner growth. One of the most important things to understand about this stage is that it is a dismantling of false motivations, not the end of motivation itself. The ego's goals often operate on the principle of "I will be happy when I get the job, when I earn the degree, when I find the partner, when I achieve the status." Spiritual awakening can expose the illusory nature of this conditional happiness, showing that fulfillment cannot be permanently secured by external achievements. When this illusion falls away, the psychic energy tied to chasing those conditions is released. But until that energy is reoriented toward soul-aligned purposes, the experience is one of emptiness or pause. This pause is also a confrontation with the shadow, the parts of the psyche that have been repressed or ignored in the pursuit of ego goals. When the ego's busyness subsides, these shadow elements can surface, sometimes bringing with them discomfort, unresolved emotions, or existential questions. This can intensify the sense of paralysis, as the individual is no longer able to distract themselves with constant striving. However, engaging with these shadow elements is part of the integration process, and it often plants the seeds for the next phase of motivation, one that arises from a more authentic place. Jung spoke of the necessity of holding the tension of opposites, and in this case, the opposites are the drive to act and the call to rest. The period of no motivation is a liminal space where these forces meet. On one hand, the ego fears losing momentum. On the other, the self demands patience and receptivity. By holding this tension without rushing to resolve it prematurely, the individual allows the psyche to reorganize in a way that will eventually produce new motivations aligned with the deeper self. This is a creative tension, though it rarely feels that way while living through it. Relationships can also be affected during this stage. Friends, family, and colleagues who knew you as a driven, ambitious person may struggle to understand the shift. They might interpret it as withdrawal, lack of ambition, or even irresponsibility. This external misunderstanding can add another layer of challenge, as you may feel compelled to justify or explain something that is in truth more of an inner process than an outer one. Jung's concept of individuation emphasizes that the path toward wholeness is often solitary in its deeper phases, not because one rejects others, but because the transformation happening within cannot be fully mirrored by the outer world until it reaches a certain level of integration. During this period, the psyche may also initiate symbolic experiences, dreams, synchronicities, and archetypal imagery that point toward emerging values and directions. A person might dream of empty rooms being cleared, of bridges half-built, or of wandering through landscapes without paths. These symbols reflect the transitional nature of the stage, the clearing of old structures and the preparation for new ones. Paying attention to these messages from the unconscious can help orient the individual, offering reassurance that while conscious motivation seems absent, deeper processes are at work. This stage can last varying lengths of time depending on the individual, their openness to inner work, and the complexity of the patterns being dismantled. For some, it is a brief interlude before new inspiration emerges. For others, it can stretch over months or even years. In either case, the dissolution of ego-driven goals is not the end of productivity or purpose, but a necessary recalibration. When the new motivations arise, they tend to be rooted in values and desires that are not contingent on external validation. They are aligned with the self, serving both the individual and the collective in a way that feels intrinsically meaningful. The old motivations sought to fill a sense of lack. The new ones emerge from a sense of wholeness, expressing itself naturally through work. relationships, and creative endeavors. The role of the unconscious in redirecting psychic energy inward. For integration after a spiritual awakening is one of the most important but least understood dynamics of this transformative process. Carl Jung's depth psychology teaches that the psyche is not only conscious thought and willpower, it is a vast interplay between the conscious mind and the unconscious, with the unconscious holding the majority of psychic material. This includes not only repressed memories and unresolved emotions, but also untapped creativity, latent archetypal forces, and the blueprint for individuation, the process of becoming the most whole, authentic version of oneself. During ordinary life before awakening, much of our psychic energy flows outward toward external goals, social roles, and culturally defined responsibilities. We are constantly projecting energy into our work, relationships, ambitions, and image management, often without recognizing how much of this energy expenditure is shaped by unconscious conditioning. When a spiritual awakening occurs, there is often a sudden or gradual recognition that the outer life is not the whole story. Experiences of heightened awareness, deep inner peace, expanded consciousness, or a direct encounter with the archetype of the self can destabilize the old ego structures. The conscious mind, which previously believed it was in control, begins to sense that something much larger is moving within. At this point, the unconscious often initiates a shift in how psychic energy is allocated. Instead of primarily flowing outward to maintain the old identity and its goals, the libido, in Jung's sense of psychic life force, is pulled inward to support integration. Integration in this context means more than simply getting used to a spiritual awakening. It is the process by which new awareness is woven into the entire psyche. Awakening often reveals truths or realities that conflict with previously held beliefs, values, or images. The unconscious must reconcile these contradictions by reconfiguring the inner landscape. This requires energy, and the psyche prioritizes this inward work over external striving. This is why so many people report feeling a sudden drop in motivation for outer achievements after awakening. The unconscious is essentially saying, there is inner work to be done before you can effectively engage outwardly again. One way to understand this is to think of the psyche as a system that can only direct a certain amount of energy at once. Before awakening, almost all of that energy is committed to navigating the outer world. After awakening, a significant portion is redirected inward, toward tasks such as integrating shadow aspects, processing emotional material that had been avoided, and building new symbolic structures that can support the expanded awareness. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not passive. It is a dynamic, intelligent system with its own aims, often operating independently of the conscious will. When the unconscious redirects energy inward, it does so for the sake of long-term growth, even if it disrupts short-term comfort. The integration process is deeply tied to archetypal activity. Awakening can trigger the emergence of powerful archetypes. From the collective unconscious, the sage, the mystic, the healer, the creator, each bringing with it a set of potentials and challenges. These archetypes often must be assimilated into the personality in a balanced way, which means the ego must learn how to relate to them without becoming inflated or overwhelmed. For example, someone who experiences an awakening might suddenly feel the call to guide others, embodying the healer archetype. But if the ego identifies with this too quickly, it can lead to spiritual bypassing or unrealistic self-importance. The unconscious redirects energy to moderate this process, helping the individual integrate the archetype in a way that is grounded and sustainable. Dreams often become more vivid and symbolically charged during this period because they are one of the main channels through which the unconscious communicates. The dream imagery might depict construction, renovation, journeys, or confrontations with shadow figures, all symbols of the inner restructuring underway. These dreams are not random. They are active expressions of the unconscious at work, showing how energy is being used to reorient the psyche. Jung believed that paying attention to such dreams could accelerate integration by making the unconscious material more accessible to the conscious mind. Another aspect of the unconscious redirection of energy is the confrontation with shadow material. Awakening can lift the lid on aspects of the self that the ego had suppressed or denied. This can include unresolved trauma, unacknowledged fears, and disowned desires. Bringing these to the surface requires significant psychic energy, not only to face them but also to reframe them in a way that allows for healing and acceptance. From an outer perspective, this might look like withdrawal, disinterest in external goals, or even regression. In reality, the unconscious is using this time to clear the blocks that would otherwise prevent the awakened state from being fully embodied. Without this clearing, old patterns would simply reassert themselves, and the awakening would remain a fleeting experience rather than a lasting transformation. Jung's concept of individuation also involves the integration of the anima or animus, the unconscious contrasexual aspects of the psyche. For men, this might mean encountering and integrating inner feminine qualities such as receptivity, intuition, and emotional depth. For women, it might involve integrating inner masculine qualities such as assertiveness, logic, and action. Awakening often intensifies this process because it exposes the incompleteness of the old ego identity, making it clear that a fuller expression of the self requires balance. Integrating these inner counterparts demands attention and energy, and again, the unconscious prioritizes this over maintaining external momentum. The redirection of energy inward can also be seen as a protective measure. The outer world often rewards speed, productivity, and decisiveness, but after awakening, acting from the old ego-driven patterns can cause harm to the integration process. The unconscious slows things down intentionally, creating a kind of incubation period where the new awareness can take root. This is why people sometimes find themselves unable to make major life decisions or pursue new projects immediately after awakening. The unconscious is essentially saying, "Not yet, let's make sure you are aligned internally before you move forward externally." In addition to psychological integration, the unconscious is often at work adjusting the somatic or bodily experience of the self. Awakening can create shifts in nervous system regulation, sensory perception, and energy flow. These changes can be taxing, requiring rest, solitude, and a gentler pace. The unconscious may direct energy toward recalibrating the body to match the new state of awareness, ensuring that the physical vessel can support the ongoing transformation. People might feel more sensitive to noise, crowds, or stimulation, not because they have become fragile, but because their system is reorganizing at a deep level. The feeling of having no motivation in this phase is therefore misleading. There is motivation, it's simply directed toward inner tasks rather than outer achievements. From the outside, it might look like nothing is happening, but inside, the unconscious is engaged in a profound reweaving of the psyche. Old beliefs are being questioned, new symbolic frameworks are forming, and the personality is being realigned with the deeper self. This is slow, often invisible work, but it is foundational to the next stage of life. Without it, the awakening remains incomplete, and the individual risks falling back into patterns that are no longer aligned with their expanded awareness. Over time, as integration progresses, the unconscious begins to release energy back into outer-directed activity, but now, that activity is guided by different values and motivations. Instead of chasing validation, status, or security, the individual feels drawn toward actions that express the authenticity of the self. This is not a return to the old way of being, but the emergence of a new way, one in which inner and outer life are in greater harmony. The period of inward redirection ensures that when outer action resumes, it is not just a continuation of the ego's agenda, but a genuine expression of the whole psyche. This process also changes the way we relate to motivation itself. In the ego-driven state, motivation often feels like a push, a constant need to discipline oneself or force movement toward a goal. After integration, motivation feels more like a pull, an organic, effortless draw toward what is meaningful. This shift is one of the clearest signs that the unconscious has completed the bulk of its inward work and is ready to channel energy outward again. But until that point, the seeming lack of motivation is better understood as an intentional, intelligent investment of psychic energy into the deepest kind of transformation. The human psyche can undergo the liminal stage between old identity collapse and new purpose formation after a spiritual awakening is one of the most delicate and transformative phases in the journey of individuation. Carl Jung's work often emphasized transitional states as being both disorienting and fertile, moments when the old structures of the psyche have dissolved but the new ones have not yet fully emerged. This space, which can feel like a psychological no man's land, is inherently liminal, a threshold between two realities, neither fully belonging to the past, nor comfortably settled into the future. Before awakening, an individual's sense of self is often deeply intertwined with the ego's narratives, goals, and social roles. These identities act as a scaffold, giving the person a clear sense of who they are, what they value, and what their life means. When awakening occurs, these scaffolds are often stripped away or revealed to be illusory. leaving the ego without its familiar reference points. This collapse can happen gradually or in a single jarring moment, but the effect is similar. The stories and ambitions that once gave life its structure lose their power. Relationships may feel different, careers may seem meaningless, and hobbies or passions that were once energizing may hold little interest. The collapse is not simply about losing motivation, it is about losing the entire framework that previously gave motivation its direction. Jung understood this as a necessary dismantling of the persona, the social mask we wear, so that the deeper self can come forward. But the dismantling itself is rarely comfortable. It often triggers feelings of confusion, emptiness, or even despair, as the conscious mind struggles to orient itself without the familiar identity markers. In this liminal stage, the individual exists in a psychological in-between space. They are no longer the person they were before awakening, but they have not yet become the person they are meant to be. This can create a sense of suspension, as though life has paused. Outwardly, this might look like a withdrawal from previous commitments or an inability to make long-term plans. Inwardly, it often feels like a deep gestation period, where the psyche is quietly reorganizing itself below the level of conscious awareness. Jung might describe this as a movement of libido inward, where the psychic energy that once maintained the old identity is now being redirected to form the foundations of a new, more integrated self. The challenge of the liminal stage is that it offers little certainty. The old goals are gone, but the new purpose has not yet taken shape. Without a clear vision of where they are going, individuals in this phase may feel lost, as though they are drifting without a map. Society does not tend to value or support this kind of inner work, often pressuring people to get back to normal or find something to do. But the truth is that the liminal stage is not a period of inactivity. It is an essential recalibration. The psyche is carefully dismantling old patterns, beliefs, and attachments, making space for a deeper alignment with the self. This threshold state often brings with it heightened sensitivity. Without the old identity to filter experience, the individual may feel more open to subtle impressions from the unconscious, synchronicities, and archetypal imagery. Dreams during this time can be especially potent, offering symbols that point toward the emerging purpose or reveal the inner work that still needs to be done. For example, dreams of crossing bridges, wandering through empty houses, or standing at the edge of a forest can reflect the liminal condition, a sense of being on the verge of something but not yet fully stepping into it. These dreams are not accidental. They are the psyche's way of orienting the conscious mind to the deeper process at play. The collapse of the old identity often means the loss of familiar roles and relationships, which can add another layer of grief to this stage. Friends and family may not understand the changes, especially if the person seems to have checked out of life as they knew it. Relationships that were based on shared values, activities, or ambitions may weaken or end altogether. While painful, this shedding process is part of the psychic clearing that makes room for a more authentic life. The new purpose that will eventually emerge often requires a new social environment, one that supports the individual's deeper values, rather than reinforcing the old patterns. But in Jungian terms, the liminal stage is also a confrontation with the shadow. Without the distractions and busyness of the old identity, repressed aspects of the psyche often rise to the surface. These may include unresolved fears, unacknowledged desires, or wounds that had been hidden beneath the structure of the persona. Facing these aspects is not optional. They must be integrated if the new self is to be whole. This confrontation can make the liminal period feel even more uncomfortable, as it forces the individual to encounter parts of themselves they may have long avoided. But it is precisely this shadow work that prepares the psyche to hold a more authentic and resilient identity in the future. The liminal stage also requires learning to live without immediate answers. In a culture that prizes clarity, certainty, and forward motion, this can be profoundly challenging. Yet Jung would argue that the lack of clarity is not a sign of failure but a sign that the unconscious is leading the process. The conscious mind, which is accustomed to steering life according to plans and logic, must learn to tolerate ambiguity and trust the deeper intelligence of the psyche. This often means cultivating patience, slowing down, and listening more closely to inner signals rather than forcing premature decisions. Archetypally, the liminal stage resembles the night sea journey or the descent into the underworld found in myths across cultures. In these stories, the hero or heroine leaves the familiar world, enters a dark and uncertain realm, faces trials and transformations, and eventually emerges renewed with new gifts or wisdom. This mythic pattern mirrors the psychological reality of the liminal stage. The collapse of the old identity is the departure, the threshold state is the descent, and the eventual emergence of new purpose is the return. Understanding the process in mythological terms can provide reassurance that this is not a random derailment but a deeply human rite of passage. During this time, the individual may feel as though they are doing nothing, but the unconscious is deeply active. It is sorting through the contents of the psyche, discarding what no longer serves, and incubating seeds of the new purpose. These seeds may reveal themselves gradually through small impulses, inspirations, or shifts in interest. However, the temptation to grasp at the first available goal should be resisted, as this can lead to recreating an identity too similar to the one that was dismantled. The liminal stage is about allowing enough space for something truly new to emerge, something that is not just a rearrangement of old patterns, but a genuine expression of the self. This stage often teaches profound lessons about being rather than doing. Without the constant drive to achieve, individuals may find themselves simply observing life, noticing details they previously overlooked, or connecting more deeply with nature and their own inner states. This receptivity is not passive. It is an active openness that allows the unconscious to communicate more freely. In Jungian terms, it is a way of engaging the transcendent function, the dialogue between conscious and unconscious that leads to the creation of something new. That the liminal stage can also shift one's relationship to time. Without the old identity's sense of urgency, time may feel slower, more spacious. Days might seem to blend together, or they may feel unusually long. This altered sense of time is another indication that the psyche is no longer operating solely on the ego's linear schedule. Instead, it is aligning with a more cyclical, organic rhythm, one that moves according to the needs of the deeper process rather than the demands of external productivity. Though the liminal stage can feel isolating, it is not without its moments of illumination. There may be flashes of insight, sudden feelings of peace, or brief glimpses of the new self taking shape. These moments are like openings in the fog, offering reassurance that the journey is moving forward even if the path is not yet clear. Over time, these glimpses become more frequent, and the contours of the new purpose begin to emerge. When that happens, motivation starts to return, but it is of a different quality than before, not a restless striving, but a natural, organic pull toward what feels deeply right. The importance of the liminal stage lies in its capacity to prevent the premature solidification of a new identity. If the old self collapses and is immediately replaced with a new set of ego goals, the deeper transformation is cut short. The liminal phase ensures that the foundations of the new self are strong, grounded in the reality of the whole psyche rather than in the illusions or compensations of the ego. By enduring this in-between space, the individual allows the psyche to complete its inner work, clearing the way for a purpose that is not only aligned with the self, but also capable of sustaining meaning over the long term. How alignment with the self reshapes motivation into soul-driven action is one of the most profound transformations that can occur after a spiritual awakening. In Carl Jung's psychology, the self is the central, organizing principle of the psyche, the totality of conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. Before awakening, much of a person's motivation tends to be shaped by the ego's needs for security, recognition, and control. Goals are often chosen based on cultural conditioning, familial expectations, and the desire to maintain a socially acceptable persona. This kind of motivation, while it can be effective in achieving certain results, is usually externally oriented. It depends on comparison, validation, or the avoidance of fear, and its energy often ebbs and flows with circumstances. When awakening occurs, it disrupts the dominance of the ego and reveals a deeper source of identity. This can be disorienting at first, because the old structures that organize motivation no longer carry the same weight. The endless striving for approval, accumulation, or status begins to feel hollow. But this disruption is also an opening. It creates space for a new kind of motivation to arise, one that is not dictated by external pressures but guided by the self. This shift is not about abandoning action altogether. Rather, it is about transforming the source from which action flows. When motivation becomes soul-driven, it is aligned with an inner sense of truth, meaning, and purpose that does not depend on external validation to sustain itself. In practical terms, alignment with the self means that the goals a person pursues are in harmony with their deepest values and authentic nature. Jung's process of individuation is precisely about bringing the ego into conscious relationship with the self, so that the personality serves the whole psyche rather than just its narrow, conscious interests. In this state, action arises naturally, from a felt sense of rightness. There is less need to force or push oneself toward a goal, because the goal is not arbitrary, it resonates deeply with the individual's inner calling. The energy to act comes from within, as though the psyche itself is drawing the person towards certain experiences or contributions. This kind of motivation is often described as intrinsic rather than extrinsic. In an ego-driven life, rewards tend to be external: money, praise, status, achievements. In a self-aligned life, the reward is in the action itself and the meaning it carries. For example, someone might choose to write, teach, create art, or help others, not because it will make them famous or wealthy, but because doing so feels like the most authentic expression of who they are. The satisfaction comes from the alignment between inner truth and outer action, not from how others react to it. One of the most important characteristics of soul-driven motivation is that it tends to be more sustainable than ego-driven motivation. The ego's desires are often insatiable. Reaching one milestone simply generates another, and there is a constant sense of not being enough. By contrast, actions that are aligned with the self are inherently fulfilling, regardless of outcome. They may still lead to external success, but their real value lies in the sense of connection and integrity they bring. This internal alignment reduces burnout and fosters resilience, because the person is no longer working against themselves. Jung observed that when the ego is too disconnected from the self, it becomes inflated or fragmented, leading to psychological imbalance. Alignment restores harmony between conscious will and unconscious wisdom. This means that the unconscious is no longer working at cross purposes with the conscious mind. In the ego-driven state, a person might set a goal that conflicts with their deeper needs, leading to procrastination, self-sabotage, or anxiety. In the self-aligned state, the unconscious supports the conscious aim, because it recognizes it as an authentic expression of the whole person. This inner cooperation creates a sense of flow, where effort feels more like participation in a larger process than like a struggle against resistance. Soul-driven action also changes the way we relate to time and pace. The ego often pushes for speed, efficiency, and quick results. The self operates on a different rhythm, one that values timing, patience, and the organic unfolding of events. Someone aligned with the self might wait years before acting on a particular vision, not out of fear or hesitation, but because they intuitively sense that the right moment has not yet arrived. When the moment does come, the action feels almost effortless, as though it was waiting to happen all along. This patience is not passivity. It is trust in the deeper intelligence of the psyche and its connection to the larger patterns of life. Another aspect of this transformation is the shift from competition to contribution. Ego-driven motivation often thrives on comparison, the need to be better than others, to win, to stand out. While there is nothing inherently wrong with striving for excellence, when it is rooted in insecurity or the need to prove oneself, it can lead to chronic dissatisfaction. In contrast, when motivation is aligned with the self, the focus shifts from proving worth to offering value. The question becomes not how can I get ahead, but what is mine to give. This shift brings a sense of service, where one's actions are seen as contributions to the whole, rather than merely as personal achievements. This change in orientation also impacts creativity. Ego-driven creativity often seeks approval or tries to anticipate what others will like. Self-aligned creativity is less concerned with fitting into expectations and more concerned with expressing truth. This can lead to work that feels riskier, because it is deeply personal, but it also tends to resonate more authentically with others. Jung's work with the collective unconscious suggests that when we express something truly authentic, we often touch on universal themes that others can relate to, even if our expression is unique to us. The reshaping of motivation also involves the integration of previously neglected parts of the self. In the ego-driven state, we may suppress aspects of our personality that do not fit with our chosen identity. The self seeks wholeness, which means reclaiming these disowned parts and allowing them to inform our choices. This integration can open up new directions and possibilities that the ego would never have considered. For instance, a person who always saw themselves as highly rational might, after awakening, discover a deep creative or intuitive side that becomes central to their life's work. The new motivation that arises from this integration is richer and more multidimensional than the old, because it is fueled by the whole psyche rather than by a limited self-concept. Soul-driven action also redefines success. In the ego framework, success is often measured by external benchmarks: income, recognition, social status. In the self-aligned framework, success is measured by the degree of authenticity. integrity, and fulfillment experienced in the process. External rewards may still come, but they are seen as byproducts rather than as the primary aim. This redefinition can be liberating, because it removes the constant pressure to meet external standards and allows the person to craft their own metrics for a meaningful life. Another important dimension is that soul-driven motivation tends to be less reactive and more responsive. The ego often reacts to situations out of fear, pride, or habit. The self responds from a place of centeredness, considering the larger context and the deeper implications of action. This responsiveness is not slower in the sense of being hesitant. It is more deliberate, grounded in the awareness that every action is part of a larger web of meaning. This makes soul-driven actions more impactful and more aligned with the individual's true role in the unfolding of their life story. The process of moving from ego-driven to soul-driven action is not instantaneous. It requires ongoing dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious, a willingness to listen to inner signals, and the courage to act on them even when they conflict with external expectations. Jung referred to this as the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to integrate opposing forces into a higher synthesis. In this case, the synthesis is between the ego's practical concerns and the self's deeper guidance, resulting in actions that are both grounded and meaningful. This alignment also brings a greater sense of peace, even in the midst of challenges, because the motivation is coming from a place of inner truth. Setbacks and obstacles are less likely to feel like personal failures. They are understood as part of the process, opportunities for growth and refinement. The person is less likely to abandon their path in the face of difficulty, because they are not simply chasing an outcome, they are living in accordance with their own nature. This perseverance is one of the hallmarks of soul-driven action. It is not sustained by willpower alone, but by the deep satisfaction of knowing that one's actions are aligned with the essence of who they are. Ultimately, the reshaping of motivation through alignment with the self transforms not only what a person does, but how and why they do it. Actions are no longer just a means to an end, they are expressions of being. Work, relationships, creativity, and even mundane tasks become part of a coherent whole, each infused with meaning. This coherence is the result of the ego